Actually, I'm quite overwhelmed to see such a turnout. It's just really wonderful and gratifying, and I have in my notes fact that I was here in 2018, 4 years ago. I spoke, so it's been a long time, and it's good that we're able to get back together again. I just tell you that I spoke last night for a group of young people of Massa. You're familiar with the program of Massa? They're youngsters from English-speaking countries who come here for about a year to study and learn and find out about Israel. And it was a wonderful group, and it was very interesting because I speak a little bit differently to young people who don't have the background and the knowledge that the people here have today, that the audience here have today. So thank you very much for coming already and for inviting me. We have seen more upheavals in our lifetime than perhaps since the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple 2,000 years ago. This upheaval expressed itself in the destruction of European Jewry, of 6 million of our people, and what is now left are the remnants and the survivors who have struggled heroically to rebuild their lives. This upheaval has hit all of us in one degree or another. And this is part of my story, how this upheaval affected my life. I am not a survivor in that sense of the word. I am a child of non-survivors. I was very lucky that my parents had the foresight to send me away from Germany with what was called the Kindertransport to England before the war broke out. And I got there just before the war broke out, and the last but one transport. I was born in Berlin. Don't have to lean forward, do it? It's okay? It's okay? I was born in Berlin to a very warm, loving family. Also, I have one older brother. We lived in a large apartment house. European way, it's in the shape of a U, a chet, and you have the buildings, the apartments going like this and this, and in the middle there's either a business or a factory, and in the middle, in the shetach of our building, was our shul. Neit Zion, it was called, and this is where we had the shul, this is where we davened, and this was a very great part of my life. I'm just telling you the background a little bit. My father was the Balkora. My uncle, his family who lived around the corner from us, was the Gabbai and the shofar blower on the high holidays. So the whole atmosphere was connected to our shul all the time. I have excuse me, allergy is very bad now. I have a early childhood memory of Friday night going to sleep and listening to my father going over the Parshat of the Shavua. This was in my head. This is what I remember very well. With a wonderful voice, which thank God my children inherited also. So It goes on through the generations. There were actually 3 types of Kindertransport. The Kindertransport that I went on combined 10,000 children that were accepted by Great Britain, by England, took in these children without parents, just children they would take, with a guarantee of £50 each, that they would not become a burden to anybody, and that the war wouldn't take very long. Another kind of a Kindertransport was Youth Aliyah, which my brother went on, a few years older than I, and that was primarily organized by Resha Freyer. Resha Freyer has a kikar not far from here on Rachel Yemenu, the wonderful woman who organized the children from Germany to get on Youth Aliyah to England for a period of 6 months in order to, so it was a kind of a hachshara. My brother already got an hachshara in Germany before that. And then after 6 months to come to Palestine. That was the plan. There was another kind of a, maybe not a Kindertransport. These were students, yeshiva boys for the most part that I'm talking about. My husband was among them, who were also let into England through the schools, through the yeshivot, and were able to save themselves. So I'm going to talk primarily, of course, about my experience, the regular Kindertransport. 10,000 children who came. But of course, before coming here, there were other things happening. My school year started the same time as Hitler came to power. So I started to go to school. I went to a Jewish all-girls school, a Jewish community all-girls school, not far from where I lived. And I remember my father used to walk me to school back and forth in the beginning. And when I got a little bit older, I was able to walk myself. However, the older I became, the more prevalent the Nazi regime became. So I would have to hide. I didn't have to, but I wanted to hide in different doorways in order to avoid the marching by and not put up my hand in the Hitler sign. Sometimes stones would be thrown at me because they see that I was going to the Jewish school. So you know that throwing stones is really nothing new, is it? As time went on, things became more difficult. I think when I was very little, we had a store. But by the time I was aware of things, we already didn't have a store. By 1933, my father had to give up the store. He dealt in confection, how do you say this in English? In knitwear clothing. And after he gave up the business for the store, he went traveling to various towns and various markets, which was the usual thing to do. So on one of his trips, he would always come back. We would always come back for Shabbos, always. So it didn't stay away. Shabbos, it always brings some nice things for us, for the children, and so on. Now, I'm going fast forward to October 1938, specifically the evening, the night of October 27 to 28 in 1938. Hitler decided that he wanted all Polish Jews out of the country. My parents had both come from Poland, although my father had been in Germany a long time, got there between the two world wars. My parents were married in Germany, in Berlin. However, that was the plan. And we didn't know anything about it. And one night, on that particular night, there was a big banging on the door, and I heard it, and I jumped up to open the door. I thought for sure that my mother had forgotten to leave the latch open, so my father had been traveling, so he couldn't get into the house. And I, all expecting to see my father, and I opened the door, and 3 big, tall, black shirts, SS Nazis were standing there. And automatically I said, my papa's not home. And I turned and I saw my father's hat there, and I thought I was really in trouble because I told a lie. Meantime, my parents got up to see what was going on, and they told my father to come with them, and without warning, without having any knowledge of this ahead of time. My mother prepared a few things, maybe some food, I don't know. He took his tallis and a tefillin, and he went. Apparently, this happened all over Germany. In Berlin, they took men and boys. Now, my brother, who slept through this in the back bedroom, turned 15 that day. The 27th of October is his birthday, and he was not on their list. They had lists prepared way ahead of time in proper German order. You know, they always had Seder. And so his name was on there because he wasn't 15 yet. He got up, he wanted to go to school. And my mother said, don't go, wait, don't go, it's dangerous, they're picking up everybody. So he went late, and luckily he went late, and they had already picked up a whole bunch of boys from the Adas Yisrael school, where he went to school, and he came back home. So my father was taken with many, many others. In other towns, smaller towns, they took whole families at great hardship. And there was a young man called Herschel Greenspan who was studying in Paris. His parents wrote to him what was happening. They had been picked up and they were being pushed into the border to Poland. He was so angry, he wanted to take revenge. He got himself a gun, and he went to the German embassy in Paris. He couldn't get to the consul, but he did shoot another official in the embassy who died later of his wounds. Of course, they caught him. But what happened subsequently, which I will talk about in a few minutes, the Kristallnacht, was given out as an excuse for Herschel Greenspan's murderous attempt. Of course, we know that this was all lies, just as the lists for what we call the Abschiebung, the picking up of all the Polish citizens was prepared ahead of time. So were all the synagogues, locations, Jewish store locations prepared ahead of time, and the Nazis knew exactly where to go and where everybody was. The expulsion itself, Germany didn't want the Polish Jews. Poland didn't want the Jews back. So we're in the middle, in no man's land, in the border between the two countries. The town in Polish is called Spongin, in German it was called Belgium. So here they are between not being able to come back and not being able to go forward. Eventually Poland had to let them in because they still had Polish passports, which were confiscated afterwards. Everybody was made stateless. And my father chose to stay in that little town in Spongin in order to be closer still to the family when the time would come that he was allowed to come back to Berlin in order to take the family wherever we could go. In that, they were billeted in a big windmill with, well, if you think of bed bunks, only you have to think much higher. And that's how they stayed, that's where they stayed. And when he did eventually come back a half a year later, he told me about a young nurse who was there and who sang beautiful Yiddish songs, which he taught me and which I've heard sing here by Chava Eiberstein. We were always listening to Yiddish records, and not just Yiddish, operatic, chazanut. We loved music, obviously. Anyway, he was able to come back 6 months later in order to, what we say, dissolve the business, which had been dissolved long ago. Now, what happened during those 6 months for us in Berlin? My mother began to run around to try and get some kind of a visas to leave Germany rather than to go to Poland. Nobody wanted to go back to Poland because Poland had never been too good to us to start with. I went with her wherever she went. We went to consulates. We went to consulate of Uruguay, Paraguay, Siam, other South American countries. The benefit for me was that I learned some geography. Other than that, the visas were worthless. As you know, nobody let us in. So my father came back and we packed up to go to Poland. Meanwhile, the papers for my brother came through and he left around, I'm talking about like from the beginning of they came in October 38, right? So 6 months later would be the springtime. So I believe my father came home before Pesach, and in May, my brother left for England, actually Scotland. His whole group of youth kids were taken to Scotland and Whittingham, and they were housed in the castle of Lord Balfour. He gave his castle for their use, and everybody knows who Lord Balfour was. And so he was already in England, and my mother prepared for me a shipment of a Nedunya, a trousseau. I was 12 years old, and she was looking ahead to see, didn't know what would happen in the future, and she wanted to have something prepared for me for later in my life. We hired a shipper, a mover, and packed everything up. My things were supposed to go to England somewhere, and the others were supposed to Poland. And and we left the end of June 1939. My papers hadn't come through yet, so I went with my parents. Now, for me, this was very special because I had been to Poland once before. My mother had taken me to meet my grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and so on. And this time I was going to stay longer until my papers came and meet and spend time with my grandparents on my father's side, grandmother on my mother's side. My grandfather had died years before. My mother was one of 9 siblings, and I knew quite a few of them because there was always a brother or a sister of my mother staying with us in Berlin, which was always nice. But I didn't know the whole families. I didn't know the cousins, and I was spoiled, and I had a really good time until I didn't. My papers came through, and at the end of July 30th, it was time for me to leave. It happened to be my father's 40th birthday, July 30th. My parents took me to the train station in Lodz. This was, by the way, I didn't mention this, but we were living in Lodz. This is where my parents came from. And my father took me all the way down to the compartments, settled me in. My mother stayed back a little bit. She didn't come all the way to the compartment. And when I think back, I wondered why she didn't. But you have to think that she had done that a couple of months earlier, let my brother go, and now she was letting me go. And once I grew up and had children of my own, I could much better understand the anguish and the worry that must have been going on at the time. So, I went through all this. Okay, so my mother prepared for me. I was allowed to take a little suitcase, and she prepared for me some extra clothing. She was a master seamstress, so it was very natural for her to make me some new dresses and whatever would fit into the suitcase. And I was allowed to take 10 marks out of Germany, but this was still going from Lodz to Berlin. I arrived in Berlin, and I had just missed the Kindertransport. I had to wait 10 days for the next shipment, so to speak, the next transport to go. So here I was in Berlin, having to wait 10 days, but I was okay. I knew where to go, not far from where we lived. There was an orphanage, a Jewish orphanage with a wonderful couple who ran it. They happened to be deaf mutes, and they had normal children, and they were very kind, and I managed to take care of myself and go to the shipper, as my father asked me, go back to the mover and see what happened, or things are not here yet. And I don't know whether they arrived. I certainly never got anything in England, so everything was stolen, we know that. So I never did hear about whether or not the thing arrived. And finally, after 10 days, I was able to join a whole group of children. I didn't know any of the other kids. Somehow I seemed to be always sort of, a little bit on the alone side. And but we boarded the trains in Liverpool Tube Station, which has become quite famous because of the Kindertransport, this particular train station in England. And since a few years ago, they put up a wonderful monument of the Kinder with the suitcases, and it's a beautiful bronze statue. Okay, we're on the train. The Nazis are on the train with us, and they're going through the luggage. And they're taking whatever thing that they can use. There was no compunction about that. I have one girl somewhat older than me, whom I met years later at one of the programs in the Amuna College for Kristallnacht. I had invited her, and they tore her necklace off her neck, and she showed me she still had the scar. And this is 50 years later. So this was the kind of journey it was until we got to the German-Dutch border. Once we got to the border and the Germans left, and the Dutch ladies came onto the train with hot cocoa and cookies and goodies, and it was like from hell to heaven. It was wonderful. It just right away gave us a good feeling and made us feel happy and so on. On to the Hook of Holland, and the boat that would take us across the English Channel to England, we landed in Harwich, and from there on another train to London. I was taken with many other children to a hostel in Willesden Lane, and there we were very comfortable, but it didn't last long. First of all, it was the first time in my life that I had eaten cornflakes. That was very interesting. And I don't remember what day of the week it was, but a few days later, it was Shabbat. It was Friday night and Shabbat. And on Friday night, some of the staff people came around and said, we have to sign to register for the school. They were going to take us out of London on Sunday because war was imminent. And we know that on that Sunday, September 1st, declaration of war, the war started. And this is Friday night before. And they said, you must sign because you have to go with the school. You can't go. And what was I going to do? I said, I can't sign. I don't write on tablets. I can't do this. Oh, but you must. It's an emergency. I'll tell you honestly that I don't remember whether or not I signed. Mm-hmm. It got blocked out of my memory, which is, I think, is a good thing. So that was, however, a crisis. I realized at that point that no longer a picnic, it's no longer just adventure or fun. This is very serious. So came Sunday, and we were again on trains, leaving London, southward, about an hour train ride, going to a county called Hertfordshire and a little town called Hemel Hempstead in Hertfordshire. There we were taken to some big hall, auditorium, I don't know what it was exactly, and people were waiting for us, local people who had volunteered to take children from London away from the danger of what they expected, the bombs, and keep them and take them into their own homes and take care of them for the time being. Now, there were not only the refugees' children, we were the minority, there were also the Cockney, the English, the young London kids, and people who came to take children. I called this whole concept, pick a kid, if you like the way the kid looked, so you said, come with me. I think that's probably what happened to us, but we were very lucky. I was picked with another little girl, about a year younger than me, who had originally come from Vienna and who had gone with her parents to Italy, away from Germany earlier, but even Italy was already with Mussolini, so they decided to send their daughter also on a Kindertransport. So there were the two of us, which was a comfort. We were not allowed to speak German, and this nice lady by the name of Mrs. Overhead took us in. And we were to call her Auntie Alice, and her husband was Uncle Bert. If anybody are from England, anyone is from England, you know that adults are always called Auntie and Uncle, and not by their first names. So we settled in with Auntie Alice and Uncle Bert. They had two sons. The older one was already in the Navy, I think an officer. The younger one was only 16 and gave us a bit of a hard time, coming from Germany, calling us names, but that didn't last long. It was upsetting, but it was something that you had to put up with. Eventually he also went into the army, so that was okay. So obviously I was not a happy little girl, and I was crying, and she would say to me, don't cry, soon you will see your mother again, and I will be your mother. And the more she wanted to be my mother, the more I cried, of course. But you have to think, you have to really think what kind of a gratitude is owed to these people who had no idea who they were getting, who the kids were. They just, out of the goodness of their hearts, they took us in and they took care of us. In my case, I was very lucky. They were kind. At one point they wanted to adopt me. They were not churchgoers, which was very lucky for me too, because an impressionable young frum girl is looking for something to hang on to, and it happened to many children. And the other little girl in English, she even had a grandmother in London. I had my brother in Scotland. All I could do was write to him and waiting for his letters to come back, which were not as frequent as I wanted. However, I will just tell you, by the way, that when my brother passed away a few years ago, my oldest nephew went through the papers in the house and so on, and he presented me with a huge envelope of my letters, 5 years of letters that I wrote to my brother all through the war years. It's very interesting and precious, and it's waiting for a book to be written. I don't know when and who, but that's it. But that's what I have. So we corresponded. We couldn't get to see each other. It took 2 years until my brother was able to come from Scotland down to where I was just to visit. We had no resources. There was no money. I didn't have pocket money as one understands it today. I had to submit a list of things that I needed. Bobby pins, pencils for school, a notebook, toothpaste, things like that. And when I submitted the list, then I would get the money to buy it, and that's what I had. We were not hungry. Everything was rationed, food was rationed, and obviously my Auntie Alice was in charge of all the ration books and everything. But to have a few pennies in your pocket to go into the Macollet and get a piece of chocolate, that was not available at the time. But I wasn't the only one, so when you have more people like yourself, you don't realize that you're suffering, because you're living, you're not suffering. You're living, you're fine. It goes on. Now, to be in touch with my parents, and my parents to write to us was difficult, because Poland was invaded right away. So you couldn't write from England to Poland, we were at war. But my relatives who lived near us in Berlin had the foresight to smuggle themselves into Belgium that same winter, a month after the Polish, it had a name, the Aktion, the Polish Aktion, where they took all the Polish citizens. They were not Polish. My uncle had lived in Palestine under the Turks.
Wow.
And two of his children were born here, and he got Turkish citizenship, and that helped him a lot. However, they were able to, the whole family, they had 5 sons and a daughter. The daughter, who was a cousin, married my mother's brother and became my aunt. So that was nice. They had a baby, and they smuggled all together into Antwerp, into Belgium. So we had the opportunity to write letters to Belgium, which was still neutral, and my family in Belgium would send it on to Poland. My father would send letters to Belgium, and Belgium would send it on to us. And that went on for a while. When Belgium was overrun by the Nazis, was already in 1940, 1, 2. That stopped. There was no more opportunity to write this way. We wrote Red Cross letters, 25 words or less, which got through for a while, and in the end they did not. The last letter that I wrote through the Red Cross came back to me. You can see it. Returned to sender by the censor. For reasons explained in memorandum enclosed in this cover. The mail didn't go through anymore at all. So we were out of touch totally. We didn't know and we didn't know what was going on in Poland. We didn't know. We were hoping. We're still hoping to see our parents, and not until after the war did we find out what happened. But we went to school. Life was pretty normal. 1 or 2 stray bombs would come into the town. One went into the playground, but there was no school that time, so it was okay. And we learned English pretty well, pretty quickly, and the refugees' children somehow excelled the local kids in school, which is not surprising. And the teachers took an interest in us. They appreciated and they took an interest in us. Once my brother could come to visit me, things were easing up a little bit, and the war, as you know, the war dragged on. What will do? I want to give you at this point a statistic. England took in 10,000 children. Of the 10,000, because of where they were put and how were they taken, we lost 1/3 to Yiddishkeit. We lost them. I have a personal example of a girl who was 3 years older than me. Now, if you're 12 and somebody is 15, they're much older, right? And she carried with her her mother's picture, her mother who wore a sheitel and very full, and she said, as she came from Munich, and she said, I have to daven now 3 times a day. She said, I have to daven. Shachas, Milkan, Marashas, daven, so fine. She was taken in by a couple who lived near us, a childless couple. Eventually, she went into the ATS, the Women's Army, the British Army, the Women's Army, and don't know what happened. She married out, never heard again, and this is just an example of what happened. But at least she was well treated, as we were well treated. But there were other children who were not well treated, who were abused, who were ill treated. And I will tell you a story about one little girl later on. We have time at the end. It's a very important story. I don't know if you realize, but I skipped over a whole piece of history before we left Berlin, because from October 28, 29 until November 9th, the infamous Kristallnacht, many things happened. And especially on November the 9th, when the synagogues were destroyed. They were burned, they were chopped to pieces, they were totally destroyed throughout Germany, except for ours, which was in our Städte, in our area, because the housing was so close by and there was a chemical factory not far away. They weren't allowed to burn it, but they destroyed it. We were still at home, my brother and mother and I, and we watched as they threw out the Sifrei Torah and all the Sifrei Kodesh, everything of this. They even picked up the benches and threw them down. And I'm doing this very quickly because this is not about Kristallnacht. And also the next day, when they destroyed all the Jewish stores, including my Uncle Gershon's store. It was a beautiful big furniture store. And that's for another time with much more detail. But just to give you the whole picture of what went on before we went away. So I'm in England, I'm in school, and all this time, nobody came to see me. We had a committee. We had more than one committee. I don't exactly know who was responsible for me or for the children that were in the little town that I was in. There were boys and girls, and we had each other. It was nice, but nobody came except when I got this. When I had to give the lists and got the money for my purchases, what I needed. Nobody said, how are you doing? How are things going? I didn't understand why nobody ever came. I found out much later, years later, after I didn't live in England anymore, that there were hostels of children, of Jewish children, with hundreds of children. There was one Rav who took 600 children, saved them, and opened up a school in Sheffield. I didn't hear about him until way years later, after I used to go back to England. We didn't know what was going on. And nobody came forward. There were also a few Jewish families that came to the town in order to get away from the Blitz. You cannot imagine that just to take a train for an hour and have one good night's sleep without bombing, this is what they used to do. And also Auntie Alice took in a couple once in a while and let them sleep in whichever, one of the places, and it was a good thing to do, and of course they paid for it. But they also used up our milk ration because she would give them breakfast, so they didn't bring their ration cards with them. So that was a bit of a problem, but it's one of the side effects of what went on, what the war was. We're going a little bit fast forward. The years went by, and it came to, it took too long. You take in a family or children, and you're good to them, but how long can it last? It's very difficult. And after a few years, it came to the point where Auntie Alice wasn't so happy anymore with us. We were growing up, and it was difficult for her to take care of us anymore, I imagine. She became moody, and we didn't know why. We would come home from school and not know what to expect. Would she smile? Would she frown? Would she be guilty of something or not? It was a very difficult time. Meantime, my brother, with his chevra, they became what was known as the land army, toiling the soil in order to grow more food for the war effort. They opened up kibbutzim. There was a kibbutz Buckingham, quite famous because the people from kibbutz Buckingham, most of them ended up in Ravi and Tirat Tzvi, so the people, they managed to come either with Aliyah Bet at the time or later on. But this is where my brother was after a few years. My sister-in-law decided she was going to try, and also she had to do, they wanted her in the army, but she wanted to be in the land army. In order to do that, she had to show that she could produce for the war effort. So she went to visit kibbutz Buckingham, and she met my brother, and the rest, as we say, was sort of history. I went to Buckingham the Pesach when I had just turned 15, So this was 3 years after I had been evacuated. I went there for Pesach, and I loved it. I wanted to stay there, and finally I said, I'll be back with my own people. I'll be comfortable. I'll be happy. And they wouldn't let me. They wouldn't let me. Why not? You're too young. I said, what kind of a shtuyot is that, too young? Get the kid away from the goyim. You know, keep her, but it didn't happen. So back I went to Hempstead for another 2 years. Anyway, my brother and sister-in-law were married in 1944, Hanukkah in December, and I went to the wedding. I had met my sister-in-law before. We arranged to meet each other somewhere midpoint where she lived and where I lived, and we hit it off beautifully. And I went to the wedding, and after the wedding, the family invited me to come for a Shabbat. My sister had a sister and her parents. Her parents were able to get to England because her grandfather, just like my uncle with the Turks, her grandfather had emigrated to South Africa at some point in his life and took out South African citizenship, which followed into my sister-in-law's parents. Her father had South African citizenship. You could go with a South African passport to England. That was part of the
Commonwealth.
Right, the British Empire, South Africa, right? So that's how they got to England. So, you know, you can go back 100 years and see what you did and see what happened afterwards. So they were living in a little town called Letchworth, also in Hertfordshire, which was, the whole estate was owned by a man named Abba Bornstein, who had built these little houses and rented them out to the people to open up a villa there and get away from the bombs, get away from London. And it was a lovely, really a kehillah. They had a Rav, Horowitz, originally from Frankfurt. They had shuls, they had mikveh, they had everything. They were a wonderful community. So I was wanting to go there for Shabbat. They invited me and I wanted to go. I came back to Auntie Alison. I said, I want to go for the weekend to my new sister-in-law. She said, you're not going. I said, I want to go. If you go, you'll never come back here. And that's exactly what I was praying for. If I go, I don't have to come back again. However, the feelings were so mixed up. It's very difficult to describe. I can still feel some of it, but it's such a dilemma that I'd never had to face in my life. I left in the morning. At that time I was already working, I wasn't in school anymore, and came back to get my things. My little suitcase was outside the door, on the doorstep. I was not allowed to come in. I was very upset. Whatever she packed, that was it. And I took my suitcase, I went to the bus stop. I took the bus. I had to take, I think, 2 or 3 buses to get from Hempstead to Letchworth. And I got to the next destination to change buses. And I hear my name being called, Miriam. I look up. My sister-in-law's sister, whose name was Marion, was sitting on top of the double-decker buses in England, and she saw me. She saw me waiting for the bus. It's like, you know, you can't say it was a coincidence. It was Mina Shabayim. She was there, and I went and sat with her, and we traveled the rest of the way alone. At that point also, as I'm standing outside, Hitler got a nice new weapon called the buzz bombs. They were bombs that were not manned. There were bombs, just bombs. Nobody had to fly a plane for that. And as long as you could hear them buzzing, buzz, 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 you were okay. But as soon as they stopped buzzing, they would drop and explode. It was a very explosive device, a bomb, which Hitler had developed toward the end of the war. Okay, I could hear the buzzing, but luckily nothing happened. And we traveled together to Letchworth, and I got there and I was in a tremendously nervous state, having been locked out of the house and not really knowing where I'm going. I know they were a wonderful family, I mean, I was hoping. And it didn't take very long. In a word, they had the last name was Becker. They had 2 daughters. One was married to my brother and married, who was still single, and I became the 3rd daughter. Just like that, thanks to my sister-in-law. That was her doing. And Baruch Hashem, I fit in. I started my new life. Meantime, my brother and sister-in-law went back to Auntie Alice to pick up the rest of my stuff. They weren't going to put up with that. I couldn't do anything, but they could. So they did. In the end, by the way, we had a reconciliation. Obviously, it couldn't stay like that, because by the time I got married, they came to my wedding and so on. Okay. What happened to some of the other children? There was a girl named Susie. A girl named Susie who, with her twin sister, at age 3, was taken from an orphanage in Munich and brought to England on the Kindertransport and taken in by a Christian minister and his wife, who were childless, to be brought up at age 3, which is of course babies. They were sort of adopted, and they were given new names. Susie was named of Grace, and the other one was named Eunice, and Eunice developed a brain tumor as she got older, and she died at an early age. But Susie, Grace, she stayed with them, and she grew up there. And when it was time for her to take the English exams, which are called 11+, which decides whether or not you can go on to a higher school, she was told to sit, according to the alphabet, with the B's. But her name of the adopted parents began with an S. And she said, why do they send me with the B's? But she didn't think too much of it. She did her exams, and that's it. And over the years, she would ask the adopted parents, who's my family? Where am I from? Who's my mother? And they would say, we don't know. Everything, all the papers were lost. We don't know. You came from the orphanage in Munich, and that's all we know. Right. Fast forward a few years later, she had a friend who was very interested in genealogy, and she said, I'm going to try and find out for you what's happening. So she did some research. At that point also, a lady by the name of senior moment, Levinson, was organizing a reunion, 50-year reunion of the Kindertransport Kinder in London. And they advertised she was interviewed on the radio and so on, and Susie heard this, and she thought, she called the woman, she called Mrs. Levinson, and she told her story. She said, we're going to meet together and we'll talk together and I'll find out for you. And after some research, she found out who she was. Her maiden name, her real name was Bechova, which is quite a famous name in Washington Heights, in the Breuer community. If anybody here is from New York and knows about Washington Heights, it's a very, very frum community. And this is her family. These are her first cousins. Her mother was a Bechova who had the children, the twins, out of wedlock with a Nazi boyfriend. Such a scandal that the family, of course, couldn't have anything to do with her, not knowing that she had the twins or anything. So now that they met up together, it was a wonderful reunion. And they took her in, and they were so happy to be together. It was a mutual admiration society, so to speak. She would go to their smachot and everything. And I'm going forward another 10 years, the 60th anniversary of our Kindertransport reunion. And there she was, one of the speakers, being interviewed. And they asked her, and she was there with her husband and her son. And she had said previously she has a son who sings in the church choir, and she doesn't know where does he get this wonderful voice from, and where does it all come from? What's all behind it? And she was asked at the time, how do you feel? Do you want to be back do you want to go back to Judaism? Do you want to stay where you are? And they asked her husband, what do you think? What do you think? He said, well, I'm happy. He said, I got a new wife with a new name. You know, instead of Grace, she became Susie. So that was good. And she decided she was okay where she was. She wasn't going to switch at this point in her life. However, she said her son was very interested in the background and was doing some research and some inquiries. So since that time, of course, I don't know what happened. Now I'm going to give you a big PS. The big PS is that she was an abused child. And when we say abused, in every sense of the word. She's written a book. There's a film called Rosa's Daughter. Her mother's name was Rosa. And there's other documentaries about her available on YouTube or somewhere. I have the names of the films. We have movies about the Kindertransport. One of them is called Into the Arms of Strangers. Her book, as I said, Rosa's Child. There's a book called Uprooted, written by a writer from New York that I was interviewed with. And you have all these stories. If I say a third was lost from the 10,000, you have a terrible example of what we're talking about. But that's what it was. I want to share with you just a few vignettes of Yom HaShoah, the real Yom HaShoah. I have here, I must show you this. I'll just hold it up. Where is it? Belgium and my Uncle Gershon. Okay. If you can see my uncle with a beautiful beard, okay? And you see a couple in front of him. It's a wedding. It's a chasana. And they're wearing the yellow stars. And it's 1942 in Antwerp. my uncle became the registrar for the Jewish community with weddings and funerals, whatever it was. And I was with my husband in Washington, D.C., just as the museum in Washington was opening, the Holocaust Museum. And it's very strict there. You have to have appointments because they want people to do they want the tour properly from top to bottom. There are 3 floors. Anybody who's been there will know what I'm talking about. Somebody's nodding here, because by the time you start until you get to the bottom, you are hemmed in. You feel that you are imprisoned. You really get the feeling that they want you to understand. We go to one of the exhibits, West European, and there are videos, scenes of the war and so on and so forth, and I'm looking at the videos, and I see here a video, and I say, it can't be. And I let it, videos, they stop and they start, they stop and they start, they always start over. I have to wait for it comes around again. I sit there again. I said to my husband, I think it's Uncle Gershon. He said, you're always seeing somebody, which is true, I'm always looking for somebody. I like your mom's still looking for somebody. And he looked with me and he said, you're right. That's it. That's Uncle Gershon. So I asked, where do you get copies of it? They said, it's in Yad Vashem, in Yerushalayim. Wonderful. At that point, I was a tour guide in Yad Vashem for 10 years. So I knew who to go to and I knew where to get it. And sure enough, I got copies of the picture for my brother and myself, fine. 2 years later, I think about 2 years later, I get the quarterly magazine, and who did they put on the cover? My Uncle Gershon. So I've got a few copies of that as well. It's very nice. Never mind they put Paul John on the back of the Okay. This is a little write-up that Ernie Meyer did, who was working for the Jerusalem Post at the time. He's no longer with us. About me when we had a 55 reunion in Yerushalayim, and he interviewed me. So if you have time later, you can look at this. I want to talk about some of the things that I experienced at Yad Vashem at the time. An artist named Elsa Pollack. Everybody's been to Yad Vashem here. Everybody's not been. Everybody's been to Yad Vashem, right? Now, in the olden days, when I used to be a tour guide there, before they refurbished, before Washington built a beautiful Holocaust Museum, and I said, why Washington? And I wasn't the only one. I said, we have here, we need so much more in Yerushalayim. I was a tour guide, we didn't have proper labels. I was tour guiding mostly in the art museum. And the labels were fading. Get it more plain, more clear, no money. And here Washington is opening up a big museum. It was very frustrating. But lo and behold, after Washington came a renewal, a refurbishing of our Yad Vashem here. So I went to Washington with a bit of an annoyance, thinking, why? But once I got there, I'll tell you, I knew why. I could see. First of all, the great majority of the visitors who go there are not Jewish. Right. It is a tremendous educational eye-opener for the world. It's marvelous. It's marvelous. And so I'm guiding here Elsa Pollack. Elsa Pollack, who was incarcerated in the camps in Auschwitz, who survived. She survived, and it took her took her 5 years before she could begin to express what she had experienced, and she did it by way of sculpture. If you've been to Yad Vashem, and you've seen the mounds of shoes, all sizes, from the tiniest baby to the largest boots, and each shoe has a number on the sole of the shoe. That's her sculpture, Elsa Pollock. If you see the tall chimneys that she sculpted with numbers all over, another tall chimney that the faces are coming out of the chimneys with screaming faces, that's also her. She did enormous amount of sculpture. And I want to quote actually what she said. I just have to find the right piece of paper. Just a second. No, I had it already. That was very organized. All right, I'll tell you. She said something like the following. I can't exactly say her words. I don't know where that paper is. But she said mankind was able to figure out the most evil, horrible things to do to other people. But mankind was not able to come up with a language, with the words to describe it. This is basically what she said. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but this is basically what she said about her own work, about her own. So a couple of little vignettes. My glasses. There was a wonderful woman named Dr. Judith Hammerberger who took the children that had been saved in Buchenwald, and took them under her care, young boys, little boys, to try and nurture them back to normalcy, to health, after they were liberated. She took care of them in France, and she helped them to become whole and human again. When they had become trusting enough and sure of their next meal, they were persuaded and agreed not to take food to bed with them. When they were able to go out by themselves into the street, the first thing they did to have their pictures taken. Why? In order that they could look at themselves and at their face and they say, I am alive, it's me, this is how I look. In my years of guiding in Yad Vashem, one of the very wonderful exhibits was by an artist named Max Platschek. I look on him here. And he specialized in pencil drawings of famous people. He was in Theresienstadt in Theresen. And we know that in Theresienstadt, what was called the crème de la crème of German Jewry, educated professors, doctors, and so on. And he drew them. He drew them, but he didn't sign his name. He had them sign their names and their credentials. Doctor or professor so-and-so of chemistry or math or whatever it was. And again, why was that? Because one even wrote, he said, this is who I am. This is how I look. Survive or not, but somebody somewhere will see that I lived, and this is who I was, and this was me. So it's a very, what can I say? It's a very big part of remembering, a very big part of what happened in the Shoah. I don't know how much time we have, or if you're getting tired. One more. there's an item told about forced labor, the men working in the salt mines. This is in the dead of winter in the salt mines. It's cold, and it's obviously forced labor, and it's miserable. And it's Erev Yom Kippur. It's Kol Nidre night, and they're working away. All of a sudden, the lights go out. It's dark. You cannot work in a mine in the dark. You have to have light. And they're looking at each other, and they're thinking, somebody starts very quietly, very slowly, to sing Kol Nidre. And bit by bit, others join in, and the lights stay out, and they're singing Kol Nidre. And one man began to say the whole Kol Nidre davening by heart, which he knew. And the wonder of it is, they had this blessed darkness, a respite from God, that the lights went out, punkt on Kol Nidre. Now, you know, these things to me are very important and very meaningful. There were two very close friends, men, I'll finish with this. They worked and they shared and they ate and they slept together. And in a particularly cruel time in the concentration camp, when one man said to his friend, he was puzzled and he was disturbed because his friend was davening all the time. What are you praying? What are you praying? It's not time for Shacharit. It's not time for Mincha. It's not time for Mar. Why are you praying all the time? What are you doing? He said, I'm praying to God. He said, is he listening at all? I said, yes. I'm praying to him because I'm thanking God for not making me like these murderers. There's a lot more to tell, but I think the hour is late, and I want to finish up with something I just read today. It's a commentary magazine which I just received. I just started to subscribe again. I used to get it for years. And it's written by Rabbi Meyer Soloveitchik, who is in New York, part of YU and so on. And he writes an article about matzah bakery in Dnipro, which is in the Ukraine. And since we know that things are very bad in the Ukraine now, I thought this would be a nice way to finish up. He writes about the bakery in this little town, in Dnipro, who bakes shmura matzah, handmade matzah, and imports it all over the place, which is very, very unusual. And he, Dafka, makes it a point to look for the shmura matzah that he uses for Pesach, made in the Ukraine from this bakery. So he writes about Sharansky. Sharansky, who was greatly concerned about all these things that are unfolding in the land of his birth, and he could still not refrain from reflecting with wonder. According to reports of those who heard him, he himself didn't hear, but he was interviewed at the Jerusalem Post, and this is what he writes about what Sharansky essentially said. And this is quoted from Sharansky. This week I was reminded of those days when I saw thousands of people standing at the border of Ukraine trying to escape. They're standing there day and night, and there's only one word that can help them get out: Jew. Jew. If you are a Jew, there are Jews outside who care about and are waiting for you. There's someone on the other side of the border who is searching for you. Your chances of leaving are excellent. The world has changed. When I was a child, Jew was an unfortunate designation. No one envied us, but today, on the Ukrainian border, identifying as a Jew is all most fortunate circumstance. It describes those who have a place to go, where their family, an entire nation, is waiting for them on the other side. I just got this today and I thought how appropriate, after speaking about running around with my mother to the consulates and getting visas who are totally worthless, and then we have this. We have a place, we have a country, we have a place to take in other Jews. And I think that is a hopeful note on which to close. Thank you.